Nau mai, hoki mai ki a the fault. E mihi ne, ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. This is a big day for me. I think I have somewhat embarrassingly described it as like Christmas for the geek in me. It's the release of New Zealand On Air's Where Are the Audiences survey. This is a sort of semi-annual piece of research which, regular listeners to this podcast will have heard me say this before. It's the only thing which is even trying to get a sense of how New Zealanders use all kinds of different mediums at both a top-line level and a more granular level. It's really focused on daily usage, and it started in 2014, and so 9 years ago now, and so you get a real sense of how that transition from traditional linear print media models to the much more sort of wildcatting digital era is going, and how our local media audiences are standing up. I'm going to interview Cam Harland, the Chief Executive of New Zealand On Air, who commissioned the research about what he sees in it, what its function is, get just a fast response from him to this research. But before he arrives, which is about 5 minutes away, I'm just going to kind of give a top line of what I see in it and what it says. I mean, the big change for me, the most glaring insight you get from it is that where we used to have somewhat of a divide at around the age of 40, where below 40 people are much more likely to be digital media consumers, and over 40 they were still more likely to be traditional media consumers. That has changed, and changed quite markedly. Now that if you're trying to draw a line where you have a sort of a dominant part of the behaviour set, it's at 60. So that bulwark where you had half the population above and half below, it's now more like 3/4 versus 1/4. But not only that, the over 60s have, probably the biggest change that you see in any cohort is over 60s using streaming services and on-demand services in particular. So that's really profound. You think about what the function of this research is narrowly for New Zealand On Air. They're going to try and reach New Zealand audiences. Up until now, the research has basically said you need to keep funding some shows for linear and make a decent chunk that are for digital audiences. Now, linear really is almost like a secondary platform. The vast bulk of audience is in the online space, and that's really, really challenging. I'm looking forward to getting into that with Cam. It's very challenging for our production sector, which still largely makes shows that feel like they're incentivized by the audience demands of linear and primetime ratings. Let's put it that way. I mean, primetime is kind of gone. That's another thing that's really extraordinary out of this is the last big ratings on linear television are the news, 7 Sharp, Sunday, Country Calendar. After that, it drops off pretty quickly with a few isolated exceptions. Basically, at 7:30, we all start to just watch whatever the hell we want to watch. For younger people, that's more likely to be YouTube. For more middle-aged people, it's TVNZ Plus and Netflix. But even for older people, that's where they tend to tune out of linear and maybe go explore more niche content. Again, that makes New Zealand On Air's job really hard. How do you try and, with your very limited putia, meet audiences that are increasingly consuming very fragmented and niche forms of media? So that's really profound. Radio and television, as you'd expect, they're just continuing to shrink in their audience. They will dispute this through agencies like GfK and Nielsen, but I don't know. It feels It feels real. It feels very real looking at this. One big winner out of this, TVNZ. Depending on how you count it, in fact, if you roll up all of their products into one, TVNZ outrates even YouTube on a daily basis, and it reaches fully 50% of New Zealand. That's pretty amazing, and it's really testament to what a job they've done with TVNZ Plus. And I think where they've done it is instructive too. It's largely the sort of 60-plus audience who I think TVNZ has done a really good job of marketing to them. Hey, when you've got broadband, have a look at TVNZ Plus on there. So migrating them to that platform, the big challenge is that the ad loads on TVNZ Plus and just the overall usage just isn't the same as the absolute gravity that existed with TVNZ1 in particular, and they just don't make as much money out of it. They'll have to change that somehow to beat that. It's also, conversely, a really tough story for RNZ, which sees a real shrinkage in its radio audience in particular. It's still number one, but only by a hair, and really it's come back from 12% to 8%. That's hard. That's hard to read in any good way. They've got a bunch of money. They'll really need to embrace digital and get it right from here on out. Similarly difficult for Kata Māori in terms of the state broadcasters. There's really bad trust numbers for news media in there. I don't put too much stock in that. I think that these trust surveys are kind of self-reinforcing, and I don't really know what they mean if the behaviour stays there. Like, what can you really do about this beyond kind of wring your hands and so on? There's a whole bunch in it. I've written a big piece of analysis on the Spinoff, which I encourage you to read. But to be honest, I think we'll be picking over this in various aspects for a while yet. So, yeah, it's a huge day. It's a fantastic, really exciting, comprehensive piece of research. We're very lucky to have it done. I'm really excited to discuss it, and I really appreciate him making the time. This is Cam Harland, the Chief Executive of New Zealand On Air on The Fold. Kia ora, Cam. Welcome back to The Fold. Really appreciate you making the time.
Oh, my friend, it's really nice to be here. Thank you for asking me. Lovely to see you back in the country and on form. And I guess the first thing to say is you're welcome. I know how much you love Where Are the Audiences. No doubt you've had a good delve into the information.
I have, but I also feel like, in my dream world, I'd have like a week with a lot of Post-its and no contact with the outside world, but we make do. I'm very grateful to have it under embargo and particularly to have the time with you. I wondered if you could start actually by just talking about the sort of motive for creating this research and what it is New Zealand On Air does with it internally.
Look, I think what we've seen pretty much as a result of the research, to be honest, is the absolute need for us to understand what's going on in the media landscape here. As a public media funding agency, we have a responsibility to deliver content to audiences, and those audiences are listed in our Act. So, in order for us to do that job, we need to actually understand where they are and sort of marry our funding strategies with a knowledge of where the audiences are kind of engaging with the content that we fund.
I mean, it's quite a complicated thing, right? And there are sort of elements of there's kind of two types of platform, even in the digital space, where there are the user-generated content platforms where you really struggle to have visibility on who is consuming the audience and how it's the extent to which it's being served for them. And then there's the more controlled ones, the likes of TVNZ Plus and the other local digital players, where there is more of a sense of control there. Yet you have to interact with both. Are you any closer to understanding how you can meaningfully engage, particularly with that sort of user-generated / social content side?
Again, a really astute question. And to be fair, I think that is probably still our largest challenge. So if you delve into the research a bit, and we'll get into the details of it as we go, no doubt, but when you see the youth skew and the sort of the 92% online video, 78% music stream, you kind of go, that is where they are living. They're living in that user-generated. I mean, obviously the largest brand in that space is YouTube. And look, as you know, I've got a couple of teenage boys, so I'm living this. And they are watching a huge amount of user-generated content. So competing with that is incredibly hard. But we have to work out a way of engaging with them. Have we cracked that? No. But we're committed to not losing them, I guess, is the key point.
So, and I want to dig into that, particularly as it pertains to music, because I think there's a really interesting, knotty discussion to be had there. But let's step back a bit in terms of looking at the sort of top line for this particular batch of where the audience is. What was it that stood out for you when you first sort of started poring over it?
Look, I think there's probably two relatively obvious key points. One is really boring. That is that we are just sort of seeing a continuation of the trends that we've been seeing for some time. So to a certain extent, there is an aspect of this which just sort of says, look, there isn't a lot of change here. Like, we're seeing increasing movement from what you would call traditional media towards digital media, right? So in each case, all of the digital media kind of metrics have increased, and all the traditional media metrics seem to be sort of on the decline. I guess the one highlight for me from the data is the significant kind of increase in on-demand viewership. So TVNZ Plus is obviously writ large in the data, but actually just generally on-demand viewership is increasing. And the sort of exciting part for us is that what we're seeing, not only from this data, but actually from the audience data that we're getting from the platforms, is that we're actually seeing really meaningful audiences when you combine traditional kind of linear audiences with the on-demand audiences. So two examples I would use, two large-scale dramas that were funded through Te Puna Kairangi recently. So The Gone, which was TVNZ and TVNZ Plus, and Far North, which is currently playing on 3 and 3 Now. Both of those dramas are doing really, really well. And it's a combination of both on-demand and linear audiences that's delivering those numbers.
I mean, that being said, there really is, one player in the local on-demand platform. And if you're sort of looking at this, from there's a clear winner here, and it's TVNZ. In fact, that new metric, which sort of bundles the reach of different audiences, actually has, on a daily basis, TVNZ ahead of even YouTube, which is quite an extraordinary achievement, I think, for a local platform. But it does, in some respects, it replicates, but even increases the extent to which, in the old world, TVNZ had this very dominant position. There was supposed to be, in a digital space, a kind of a more of a democratizing of audiences, and yet you're really seeing TVNZ almost as the only real scale player in a local on-demand audience, with all due respect to 3 Now. If you look at the relative sizes of those audiences, how does New Zealand On Air begin to sort of grapple with that reality? And is there a case for, and I'm aware this might be getting outside of your purview, but, almost putting more New Zealand On Air funded productions within a TVNZ Plus environment, just because the scale of the audience is so significant?
So there's probably a couple of points to make there. The first one is, I think, I would say, yes, absolutely. I mean, TVNZ should be really delighted with these results, and presumably they won't be a massive surprise to them because they'll be doing their own internal measurements themselves. I think it's fair to say, though, that even Glenn Kine at Warner Brothers Discovery has sort of said, or acknowledged that TVNZ has invested significantly in their on-demand platform and have done for a while. So to a certain extent, there's an element of catch-up here. I kind of still have a bit of faith. I mean, my perspective from this is we're seeing local platforms migrating across to digital, and they're grabbing audience as they go. So yes, TVNZ is clearly ahead, but I kind of look at Sky at 30 and Warner Brothers Discovery at 22 in the combined channel space and go, well, it'd be really interesting to see what that looks like in a couple of years. And I mean that. I mean, we've been having a look at the data from sort of Far North, which is an example of a show that's playing on both of Warner Brothers Discovery's two channels, if you like, sort of linear and on demand, and it's doing well. So I'm not sure that I would be kind of giving up on everyone else just yet. I guess the other point here is to say, what do we do with our investment strategies in relation to this? And I guess certainly what we have already signalled is that we are not limiting the investment that we would put into on-demand shows or on-demand only shows. So we used to have a cap on how much we'd invest in digital content. Obviously, that cap has gone, quite rightly. But I guess what we're also seeing is that combination of on-demand and linear is actually where we're seeing really good audiences. So they're kind of working off each other.
So, I mean, so that's talking about television. The other thing New Zealand On Air funds, not anything like the same scale, but it's a big and important part of what you do, is in the music space. And just as we have seen linear TV audiences decline, you're seeing a really significant decline in radio audiences here. And yet radio is still a big part of the thinking when it comes to New Zealand On Air's music funding. And certainly, you know, the way that the algorithm, you know, Spotify has had an incredible result in this survey, you know, just extraordinary levels of penetration here, and is a big part of the changing shape of music consumption. And yet the amount of New Zealand content which is consumed in a radio environment is, you know, is much lower, as you know, my sources suggest, than is happening in radio. How do you start to grapple with that sort of dynamic within music?
I mean, in many ways, it's a similar argument to content, to screen content, right? Which is we are agnostic as to where the content plays, right? So what we do in music is we fund music singles or music albums or projects, as we call them. Yes, they play on radio, but they can just as likely be streamed on Spotify. And we measure the output of the songs and content that we fund in music across different platforms. You're right, though. The challenge for music within the Spotify algorithm is kind of no different to the challenge for screen content in an international kind of streamers algorithm as well, which is there's so much competition. How do you get cut through, and how do you get New Zealand audiences to engage with that content? We've just recently completed a review of our music funding strategies, and there's some really interesting things in there which we'll be able to talk to you about a little bit down the line. But I think to a certain extent, without kind of wanting to be too sort of flippant about it, the key thing is to fund really good quality content and think deeply about how you promote it. So you would have seen recently the changes to our overall kind of funding strategy, which firstly says that audience information, data and insights is crucial to our organisation and how we inform our funding strategies, which obviously we're the audiences are part of it. But also discoverability and promotion of the content that we fund is a really key component as well. And I think it's going to increasingly be a topic of conversation and quite potentially an area of investment for us. So how do we make sure that the songs that we fund, the screen content that we're funding, is known to New Zealand audiences so that they can access it? Yes, radio is really important to us. And in truth, I think the other important point to make, Duncan, is that the radio stations, even the broadcast platforms, they all have their own other measurements, right? So radio will say they've got GFK and that, their data might be different to what we're seeing. The radio usage and where are the audience is kind of relatively static in terms of the kind of level of engagement.
One other thing that stuck out to me that I thought was quite fascinating was the evolution in prime time. That historically, that was one area that sort of TV's true believers could rightly point to and say the actual, in terms of total minutes consumed by audiences, especially in prime time, nothing really touches. A lot of people grazingly use Facebook, for example, but nothing touches that kind of sit down, turn on the TV for 2 or 3 hours a night, and that's actually something you've started to see really significant decline. And that mirrors the Nielsen ratings, which show you've got a few very high rating shows between sort of 5 and 7:30 p.m. And thereafter, it seems like even for older New Zealanders who might have been the bulk of linear TV ratings historically, now they're starting to use on-demand and subscription on-demand platforms. What do you see there, and how does that sort of feed into your thinking?
I'm not massively surprised about that, and I guess partially because I'm a consumer of media. No doubt, Duncan, you are as well. We're a similar age, and we're probably engaging in media very similarly to what we're seeing in this survey, right? So, if I think about my viewing, I still watch. If I can, like TVNZ or News Hub News. Even at 6 o'clock, like literally through my Sky decoder. But I was watching the other night Taskmaster on TVNZ, like literally live at the same time through Sky with the ads. Was getting ready to watch Far North, and then suddenly thought, hang on, why am I waiting half an hour? I can watch that now, and went to 3 Now to watch it. So. I guess what we're seeing is just an ongoing move towards consumer control about when and where they're going to watch content. So there sort of isn't really a prime time, but there's sort of content that kind of works in that space, right? So as I said, if we look at The Gone, we look at Far North. Actually, by the way, we look at the numbers for Taskmaster and 7 Days. They're going really, really well. So whether that be watching it at the time that they're supposed to be playing or whether people are watching it at a time that they want to, the content is still performing.
So and that's true, but I also want to sort of challenge it a bit because in return to what we were talking about at the top about the sort of, if you look at the behaviour for 15 to 24 or 15 to 39, and I'm sure this is borne out in the numbers for even shows like Taskmaster and the Gone and so on, that audience is still appreciably much lower. Even that is much more likely to be a YouTube audience, and the New Zealand on air strategy in that place still feels nascent, or like, do you for TikTok, for Instagram, for YouTube, where a lot of younger audiences are for increasingly longer durations, and they're much harder to control. Even if you do fund content for them, even if they get great numbers, how do you know that they're here? And you can't abandon them. Like, where are you at? Like, this is almost remains one of the big challenges in front of your organisation.
Yeah, you're right. It's a good provocation. Thank you. And it's, really simple. So we've got it sort of sorted and we'll release that next week. No, I'm joking. We do have a youth strategy that has been put in front of our board and that we will be releasing reasonably soon. I actually need to catch up with my colleague, your friend Amy, on that. But, the truth of the matter is we can't just let that audience go, right? I mean, they are fundamentally important to this country, to our democracy, to all of those things. The algorithms that sit within those platforms are pretty sort of difficult to kind of break down. So there's a whole bunch of conversations that need to be had in that space. But in terms of simply funding great youth content that might have our young people in this country seek out. That is definitely a priority for us, and we will be doing some things in the next little while in this space. I guess we've always, as an agency, as you know, mate, we've always kind of taken to a certain degree, and actually sometimes, to be fair, I think to your frustration, a kind of keep calm and carry on mentality, right? So we can't just sway crazily across from one side to the next, because I think, as we would all acknowledge, this is a really, really complex ecosystem that we're operating in. And it's a really small ecosystem if you think about the size of the market. We've got 5 million people in this country. We've got a lot of really vital audiences that we need to kind of make sure we're delivering content for. But of course, that youth audience is a fundamental one. So we definitely will be investing in content for that audience, and we do need to acknowledge that content does need to be where they are. As you know, we've traditionally had a model that has had some safeguards around it because we are expending taxpayer funds, right? So we, as you know, have a non-editorial remit within our legislation. So if we fund someone, they can go off and make whatever it is that they're making, and we can't get involved. So traditionally we've used the platforms as a sort of a commissioning body for us on that front. Now, there is no commissioning resourcing that sits within YouTube, for instance. So we need to be really careful about how we fund that content to ensure that taxpayer money is put to the right outcome. So you're nodding, which is good, because you understand that. That isn't to say we won't do it, and it isn't to say that there aren't other solutions that we can come up with to counter that risk. We just need to think about how we embrace it.
Another thing that sort of leaps out in some ways is actually potentially like quite a positive thing from New Zealand Air's perspective, is that some of those sharp divisions across certain demographic horizontals, if you will, around the different ways that Māori, Pacific, Asian men, women consume content are starting to be less stark. As the digital tide sweeps through, and you've got a much older New Zealanders and a larger block who are consuming things in a more similar way. Does that, in some respects, kind of make the job, which was very complex during the motion, as we now sort of come towards the end, is the fact that the difference between Māori, Pākehā, Pacific consumption is less stark than it might have been a few years ago? Does that sort of help, in some respects, make the job somewhat easier?
I sort of think it does, insofar as we don't have to kind of think quite as deeply about the where. We do need to continue to think deeply about the what and the how. So for us, we need to see, we want to see increasing development of voice. So if we're, as you well know, Duncan, if we're delivering content for a Māori audience or a Pacific or a Pan-Asian audience, we need to see creators from those audiences involved in making that content. So the other extra final part of our new strategy is definitely about investing a little bit more heavily in developing creative talent, and being quite purposeful around sort of saying, look, if we want to deliver to those audiences, we need to see more access to our funds by uplifting creators. But yeah, look, I mean, you're right. That mix is changing. The youth piece is the most stark, though. No question. That's the bit that's giving us the most. I wouldn't say headaches, but we're certainly thinking about it.
I mean, in some ways, it feels unsolvable. In the sense that the platforms of choice for younger New Zealanders have been quite well established now as algorithmically driven, as without a level of top-down editorial control that exists on other platforms, and absent some quite, maybe not draconian, but certainly a heavy government intervention to kind of force a particular behaviour set from the platforms, that will continue to exist. But anyway, that's a knotty conversation I'm sure we'll pick up when your youth strategy comes out.
I mean, I might just say one quick thing though. I mean, this is a constantly evolving ecosystem that we work within, and I guess that's why it's an exciting place to work, right? So if you go back in time and have a look at sort of where are the audiences, obviously we've seen a whole bunch of change and we've seen consistent change in certain things, but TikTok didn't exist when we first started. Where are the audiences? So I know, look, I'm not being as naive as to say that suddenly, our youth audience is going to, stop watching, user-generated content and start to engage back with, important, purposeful kind of public media content. But, things constantly evolve and change. And I guess we just need to kind of make sure we're continuing to check in and see where people are at as much as we can.
I mean, that's the case for the research, though. I would say that TikTok almost feels like Exhibit A in why it only gets harder, not easier for, because obviously the big innovation that is a truly global, hyper-personalized platform of content that is extremely difficult for you to fund. But
yeah, but you know what? I just got sent a little TikTok video from my son, my 17-year-old son, yesterday, because he's about to turn 18, so he can vote. I think he's turning 18 in the next few weeks, and he came across a video on TikTok that was basically informing him of different policies from National Labour and some of the other parties. He was engaging in that. You guys yourself with youth wings and other things that you're doing right now, there is a relevance to getting in front of some of these young people who for the first time will be voting, and they are engaging with local content and they're engaging with it on those platforms. Now, look, hey, don't get me wrong, I'm not looking through rose-tinted glasses, but that kind of took me by surprise that he had found it, or it had found him, more likely, but he was engaging with it. So, hey.
That's a hopeful note to end on, and this research, if nothing else, and it does so much, but it gives us a clear-eyed look at where we're at and a snapshot of how this country is evolving. It's never less than fascinating. Cam, thanks so much for making the time. I really appreciate it, and looking forward to seeing how it rolls out from tomorrow.
Oh, my pleasure. Good to chat to you as always, Duncan.
That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.